Hello, everyone. I will start this video by remembering how when I lived in West Virginia, I remember going to the supermarkets and looking at products like fruits, vegetables, and produce that they were grown in countries like Mexico. As you see the case of limes on the screen picture. And as you can see also in the labels, these were distributed by companies that were based on the border, like in Mission, Texas. And I wonder how these products were moved and transported and distributed to the different centers of consumption in the US. So that's the topic that we will be looking at today for this chapter 11, which is physical distribution concepts and business to business markets. So let's start by defining what is a distribution channel. Well, these are a series of firms and individuals or entities, organizations that facilitate the movement of a product to the final consumer. A channel of distribution may be direct or indirect. A direct channel, you have a producer who sells directly to the consumer. And indirect channels are those in which there are some intermediaries or middlemen in between the producer and the final consumer. And we will see that in the next parts of this presentation. So first of all, why are there intermediaries as part of distribution channels, although sometimes these intermediaries are criticized? Well, they provide a benefit and they play an important role. If you recall from chapter 1's concepts, you may remember the utility in terms of time, place, and possession. And this is for both the consumer and also for the companies or organizations that provide those. Distribution channels provide logistics and physical distribution. And of course, they obtain some cut or commission or percentage or some sort of margin for doing that. And that's why the prices go up from the producer to the final consumer. And importantly, distribution channels create efficiencies which reduce the number of transactions, for instance, that you as a customers have to go through to buy the things that you need at home, right? Instead of going, for instance, as you see on the left-hand side of the screen, to different stores, to different producers or sellers by engaging in multiple transactions, when you have intermediaries like a retailer, in this case, Walmart, as you see on the right-hand side, you do fewer transactions at a single place or a fewer number of stores where you find those products that otherwise you would have to get from the different individual suppliers. Now, from the perspective of companies, you have also functions that intermediaries play, such as breaking the bulk of those large quantities that are purchased by the intermediaries, let's say a wholesaler, and dividing those into smaller quantities or volumes that are demanded by either retailers or other participants in the distribution channels. Sometimes these intermediaries often will purchase a number of goods and products from different suppliers, and they put them together into larger volumes that are demanded by larger companies. For example, let's talk about the case of a cereal company like Kellogg's. So in order to produce cornflakes, they need to buy huge quantities of corn. And these quantities are not produced by a single farmer, right? So intermediaries buy from different farmers and concentrate those large volumes so they can sell them to companies that require those large amounts, like Kellogg's, for producing cornflakes, right? Intermediaries also provide assortments of products that are needed by the consumer. And for instance, if you are buying candies for Halloween, well, you probably will find different assortments of candies and chocolates and lollipops and chewing gums, etc., at that single place. And that's because an intermediary, a wholesaler or distributor, was in charge of creating those assortments so that customers may find different variety of products that otherwise, again, you would have to find individually from different sellers. Another function performed by intermediaries is transportation and storage, which of course is critical for many companies. Some other functions relate to the facilitation of the processes for both customers and manufacturers. Sometimes the wholesalers or distributors will give credit to the retailers, right? For instance, they deliver the merchandise and they collect the money for those in 30 days or in 2 weeks or sometime in the future without charging necessarily an interest for that, which is something that, of course, is a benefit for the participants in the distribution channel. Maybe the intermediaries will do research. Let's say that you are going to have a distribution in another region of the country, or maybe in another country, and you are not familiar with the consumer in that area. So a market research benefit provided by that intermediary is also an important advantage for you as a company who is doing business with that wholesaler or distributor. This will also be taking risks. For instance, when they purchase the part of the inventory that they have, and they don't know for sure whether this will be something sold soon or it'll take few weeks or it'll take longer, right? So having the inventory there on the shelves with uncertainty of when it's going to be sold, well, that's also an important risk that they take. They also will be interested in promoting and pushing your product with other members of the distribution channel, right? So if you have a wholesaler who buys from you as a producer, well, those wholesalers will be making a sales effort with other retailers that they want to sell the products to so that they can make a profit also. So it's like a chain that everybody will benefit, so they will work on behalf of you in your representation into promoting the products. There are two major types of intermediaries, those that are independent and those that are manufacturer-owned intermediaries. Talking about those who are independent, the most typical or common type of intermediary is the full-service merchant wholesalers. These are companies that As you see in the case of this firm, which is called L&F Distributors here in South Texas, well, they have distribution for different areas in South Texas. And if you click here, for instance, in Corpus Christi, they outline what are the different brands that they distribute in the area. As you can see, these are mostly beverages, alcohol and non-alcohol beverages. So a distributor like this one is the most typical type of intermediary that provides the transportation, provides some other benefits like credit, right? As I mentioned before. There are other type of wholesalers that are called limited service, in which maybe they don't provide the transportation, they don't provide credit. An example of these are the cash and carry wholesalers, in which you, for example, who own a small business and you need certain supplies, well, you probably will go there and carry them yourself. Maybe a small restaurant that needs napkins or needs some plates, and then these are typical type of wholesalers for certain lines of business. I told you starting this presentation, I lived in West Virginia, and I remember in some Mexican restaurants there, I saw truck jobbers as wholesalers who distributed Mexican food products to these restaurants, right? Like tortillas or things like that. And they came from other states like Kentucky or North Carolina because there were no producers in the area. So these truck jobbers, they distributed in their vans or other vehicles the products to these restaurants. So this is another type of intermediary that in the case of restaurants and other similar businesses are very commonly used because they are suitable for those type of operations. Continuing in West Virginia, I remember looking at these drop shippers like what you see on your screen, because over there you have an important mining industry activity. So for transporting minerals and mining products and coal, in this case, you rely on these drop shippers, which in certain geographical areas of the United States or in other countries may be the typical way of distributing some goods and products. In certain industries, you rely more on mail orders wholesalers. Now, at this point, you have not only regular mail, which probably is decreasing, but you have also online ordering systems, or maybe through the phone. I mean, doesn't matter. What matters in this type of intermediaries is that they are based on catalogs, right? So business members of the distribution channels use this type of wholesalers if that is what is customary in that line of business. For certain products, for certain items like magazines, as you see on this picture, you utilize rack jobbers. These rack jobbers don't just distribute the magazines in this case, but they go every once in a while in the week to the stores, to the retailers. So they arrange the magazines, so they perform other functions that is not just distributing or delivering the products. So again, this depends on the specific setting that our business or industry operates. Agents and brokers, this is another instance of intermediaries. The difference between this type of intermediaries and the ones we just talked before is that agents and brokers do not take title to the product. The wholesalers that we just looked at, they purchase from the producer and they are the owners. They take ownership of the inventory and they resell it. Well, agents and brokers never take title to the product. They get a commission on what they sell. So they are often called manufacturers agents or selling agents. In the case of agricultural products, they are referred to as commission merchants. When you are dealing with international trade, cross-border import and export activities, you use in the distribution channel merchandise brokers like here in South Texas, in Laredo, Brownsville, in the Rio Grande Valley, or here in Corpus Christi, in the port of Corpus Christi. Now, some other industries and business settings rely more on the manufacturer-owned intermediaries. So this depends on the structure of the market. If you have large companies and depending on the type of products, like soft drinks and beverages, you may have in some geographical areas that the intermediaries and the wholesalers and distributors are part of the companies, like Coca-Cola, for example. In Latin America, many countries, they have their own distribution channels. So they have their own trucks and vehicles, and they operate the whole distribution channel. Sometimes they have their own sales offices, manufacturers, showrooms. Some companies own the factories that produce, for example, craftsman's tools and equipment, etc. Well, this was owned by Sears stores or the corporation. So Craftsman products were sold fundamentally through Sears stores. So here you have the same company that owns the production and also the distribution. Now, what you see here on figure 11.3 is the different arrangements or structures of distribution channels, right? We call also the levels, the number of levels that a distribution channel is made up of. So for example, the very first channel that you see here on top of this figure, which is a direct link between the producer and the consumer, that's the most basic type of distribution channel with two levels. You have two levels because you have the producer on the left and the consumer or the customer on the right-hand side. Now, in the next one that you see below that, you have three levels because you add a retailer in between that producer-customer relation. And then if you keep going down, well, you have a wholesaler, so you add a fourth level. And depending on the complexity, the geographical distance, the market structure, you may have 5 or more levels when you have producers and then intermediaries like wholesalers plus retailers, and then the final customers. In the case of a consumer channel, what you have is the relation between the producer and the final customer. As you see here, the different cases on the figure of your screen for consumer channel. And in the case of business-to-business channels or B2B channels, what you are dealing with is a relationship between a business and another business, not a final consumer. You don't have a final user on the right-hand side. What you have is as you see there, Amazon or an auto repair establishment or a restaurant, etc. These are other companies who will in turn sell to another customer. So these companies will do either resell the product like Amazon or other retailers, or maybe will do some process, some manufacturing, etc. And of course, these are not mutually exclusive options. You can have some companies that say certain channels will be direct and certain channels for certain customers or markets will be indirect, right? You can have a combination, and these are called hybrid marketing systems. Now, whenever we talk about distribution channels, we have to take into consideration the implications for other components of the marketing mix. Remember that distribution channels is one of the components of the marketing mix, or the 4 Ps. You recall we have product, we have price, we have promotions, and the 4th P, which stands for place or distribution. These are all interconnected. Ideally, as part of your marketing strategy, you want an integrated approach that takes into account the different elements or components of the marketing mix. So a channel decision could impact other areas, and ideally you want them aligned one with each other. For example, if your pricing objective, if you remember from chapter 10 on pricing, you may have a pricing objective for increasing market share and revenue and sales. Well, if that's the pricing objective, then the distribution tactics must be aligned and consistent with that. So you would have more likely a distribution approach of being in every possible point of sale and retailer across town or a state or a country, right? Because you want that product that you offer to be readily available close to the consumer in every possible retailer or point of sale, right? Instead of having it only in certain stores. So you have an alignment of the pricing objective with the distribution implementation. Maybe the distribution decision is related to the positioning of the product. How you promote a product, how it is positioned in the mind of consumer, for instance, being readily and easily available with quick delivery. Well, if that's your promotional effort that you are advertising, for instance, then your distribution channels must support that position. You got to take into account also the physical features, the characteristics, the complexity of the product when deciding what distribution channel structures and members will be supporting your marketing approach, because it's not the same to distribute, let's say, shoes, a pair of shoes or apparel and clothing versus distributing automobiles, right? Or industrial equipment. So you require different distribution channels for that. And just as we have seen in previous chapters that there are different steps in planning, well, for distribution, we have also to consider different steps. And of course, as we've seen before, the very first thing is to have clarity of what are the objectives that we are aiming to accomplish. So you gotta ask yourself, for this company that focuses on these products, what is the objective of our distribution strategy? Are we concentrating on sales, on profits, on market share? So this will depend on different characteristics of the products. Step number 2, you got to look at the internal and external environment. And this is something that you are familiar with. If you remember from chapter 3, the strategic market planning chapter, well, at some point you have to do a situation analysis to acknowledge and recognize what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. Looking internally, right? Are your resources, are your capacities, and also looking externally. The economic, the regulatory, the technological environment, competitors. For step 3, where you have to choose a distribution strategy, remember that you determine already how many levels in the distribution channel you are pursuing. And besides that, there are 2 decisions to make. First, whether you will go with a conventional vertical or horizontal structure. And 2, whether you will have a intensive, a selective, or a combination of those 2 type of distribution intensities. So a conventional structure will be the one in which the members of the channel are independent, right? The vertical structure, you have these different members that you are part of, but there is typically a captain leader or a member that has more power or is more dominant and therefore is more influential on the decisions of the channel. So for example, if you are a producer and you sell in large retailers like Target or H-E-B or Kroger, etc. Well, these large retailers, this probably will be the leaders of that vertical system, right? Now, the other possibility is to be part of a horizontal channel or horizontal structure in which you work with other type of intermediaries, but no one is more powerful or more dominant than others. They are pretty much at the same level. And the distribution intensity, remember, you have a intensive distribution, which is pretty much trying to put your product in as many places as possible, as many distributors and retailers as possible. And then you have on the opposite, the selective strategy. For example, products that are positioned like very exclusive, very high quality, expensive products that are not for every customer. Well, maybe that would be making more sense with a selective distribution strategy approach. And you have in the middle a combination of both. Finally, you have to think about 2 aspects of the implementation, which is selecting a partner based on all the considerations that we have looked already. So after having clarity in those considerations, you select a partner considering the economic and competitive factors, the type of relationships, and sustainability factors as well, which eventually have to be managed in a more routine or operational based fashion. And here is where we go into the topic of logistics and supply chain. So logistics have to do with this operational, the nitty-gritty implementation activities that support the channel decisions, right? As part of a broader supply chain. So for example, what you see on your screen is a figure that is a depiction of the complexity of the logistics and supply chain process, where a company, which is in the center, interested in procuring and making sure that there is a smooth production and transportation and distribution to the final customers. This process is coordinated and requires overseeing and managing the different aspects of the process, which can be broken down in 5 types of activities or specific tasks, which is the processing of the orders, the warehousing, right? Where are these inventories going to be stored? Do you have the capacity, the resources for these warehouses? How are the materials going to be handled so that they are not damaged and they are readily available for the next function, which is the transportation, which should be selected according to the criteria that is prioritized. What is the criteria for selecting transportation? Is it based on costs? Is it based on speed? Which transportation modality is faster? Because time is of critical importance for the type of business you are into. Maybe it's none of the above. Maybe the criteria is whatever is available because you are in a market, in a country, or a region of the country where there are not many options to choose from. So you select whatever is available. And last but not least, the inventory control. You gotta have an updated, optimal system for inventory control so that whenever there is an order that is placed by other intermediaries in the distribution channel or by customers, you have that certainty that the products are there for you to sell them. It has happened to you probably that you place an order, let's say at a company's website that you want to pick up at their store, and you find out that they don't have that product there. Although you purchased the product, they don't give it to you because they don't have it. So they reimburse you or something, but that was likely a mistake with the inventory control system. Now, many of the issues we've been looking at so far are dealing with this business to business setting or relations. And if you remember from chapter 6, we looked at the topic of consumer markets, right? And how individual consumers go through a decision-making process and decide what to buy. Well, many of these same products are not directed or marketed to individual consumers, but these are directed and marketed to other businesses, to other organizations who will not necessarily be the final users. Maybe sometimes they will be, other times they will be using those products for other purposes, maybe to provide services to third parties. Maybe they will be manufacturing, transforming those products, right? So what you sell to them is an input, or material that they will use, so they in turn will produce something else. So we need to identify different type of customers in the business to business environment or the business marketplace. As you see on the screen right here, you have producers, which is one category, which can be broken down into the primary, secondary, and tertiary sector. The primary sector is fishing, agricultural, lumber, mining industries. The secondary would be manufacturers, companies that are, for instance, factories that use the primary products to do something else. And then the tertiary sector are pretty much services, hospitality, financial services, stores and retailers, entertainment, healthcare, etc. And they use the products which are made available from the primary and secondary sector, right? And then vice versa. Services are also provided to the secondary and the primary sector. So there is a whole complexity here of transactions between these business entities or different companies. And of course, this requires distribution channels. Now, these distribution channels also go across other type of business companies or organizations, which are the resellers. And here we are talking about distributors, wholesalers, and retailers, which can be the traditional brick and mortar stores or online retailers. And last but not least, you have non-commercial, non-government, non-for-profit organizations like government, like churches, like community groups, etc. They all require also products that are used just like the producers and the resellers. So it's necessary to identify or distinguish what difference are between the conventional consumer markets, that is what we have been mostly focusing on throughout the course, and business to business or organizational markets. So first of all, in the case of business and organizational markets, you have multiple buyers. You don't have an individual person that will necessarily make a decision unless it is maybe a small micro business or company with few employees. Yeah, maybe the owner or this manager will be making decisions, but typically larger organizations, you would have multiple buyers, right? You probably will have a department that will be in charge of that with different staff in charge of that decision. So all those considerations that we looked at in chapter 6 about internal needs and wants and individual characteristics and personality and values, etc., that usually come into play in a individual consumer decision making, this does not happen in the same way for business and organizational markets. Then, as you can see on the right-hand side, you have a difference in the number of customers, right? For consumer markets, you typically market and promote and try to distribute for hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands or millions of consumers who purchase shoes or soft drinks or smartphones. Yeah, but for business and organizational markets, you have fewer customers, right? if you are trying to sell and market some industrial product to oil refineries here in Corpus Christi, let's say, well, you have only 3 or 4 refineries in the region. So you count it with your hand. Of course, as you see on the left-hand side, the size of their purchases will be larger. Yeah, you have fewer customers, but they are not gonna buy you 1 gallon or 1 box of whatever product you sell. They will purchase large volumes. So the size of those purchases will be much larger. And finally, as you see at the bottom of this figure, they will be likely concentrated in a specific geographic location rather than distributing across the state of Texas or across the United States. Well, you have some refineries here in Corpus Christi, some others in Houston and Baytown area, for instance, and others further east in Louisiana. Well, so you have to focus on those specific geographic locations where they are concentrated. In chapter 10, we talk about the pricing of products and some concepts related to the demand. Well, for business to business, you have to consider some distinctions in terms of demand, which is not necessarily the same. First, for B2B markets, you have what is called derived demand. So you have to monitor the demand, not just of your immediate customer that purchased from you, but you gotta look at what is the demand of those other customers and markets down the road who will eventually purchase the product that are manufactured, the ultimate product that is manufactured with the goods that you produce. Second, demand is more inelastic. If there is a variation in the price of those products at the end of the distribution channel in the final customer, that small variation in price does not necessarily mean that throughout the distribution channel, there will be a large variation in demand. Now, whenever there is a sufficient change in the demand and there is a fluctuation, then you will have a larger effect on the quantities demanded on your side. And finally, demand for business to business markets is very often a joint demand, which means that it depends on the availability of other products that are used for manufacturing whatever is built with your products. So for example, if you sell aluminum for a automobile manufacturer, well, that demand for aluminum will also depend on the availability of plastic and glass and other products that are used for building automobiles, because they are needed together for building or making an automobile. The type of purchases that are typically encountered with in business to business transactions is the straight rebuy, which is pretty much continuing buying from the same suppliers or vendors or members of the distribution channel. A modified rebuy, which is doing adjustments or changes to those previous purchases that you are used to. And of course, the most complicated is the new task rebuy, which is when you want to introduce, for example, a new product to be distributed by certain wholesaler or carried by a retailer. So you need to do a much greater sales effort there. And again, many of these tasks will be carried out by specialized professional buying agents, especially in larger firms where you have procurement offices and divisions or areas that do this in a more professional way, which again, as you see in figure 11.10, this does not follow necessarily the same type of specific actions as in the individual consumer markets decision-making process. Why? Because you will here, of course, have a recognition of a problem that needs to be addressed or solved, and search for information and evaluate different alternatives. Yeah, but you will not use the same criteria, individual personal criteria. You will be focusing mostly on objective product specification, prices, warranties, the people who will recognize the problem or bring it up to the attention of the company. These are not necessarily the final users of the product, like in the case of a consumer market situation. And of course, this is something that requires a whole set of different factors to take into account because of the characteristics of business to business purchases, which again is larger quantities, probably more expensive, and these rely more on continuous repetitive purchases, right? So feel free to send me an email in case you have any question. Thank you.